A 9-foot-tall giant storms across the battlefield, his bronze armor gleaming like a tank, his spear tip alone weighing 15 pounds, while across the valley, a shepherd boy picks up 5 smooth stones from a brook. Today's warfare? F-22 fighter jets streak across the sky at 1,500 miles per hour, Hellfire missiles lock onto targets from 20 miles away, and M1 Abrams tanks roll forward with 68 tons of armored devastation. But 3,000 years ago, there were no missiles, no jets, no tanks, just flesh and blood and faith facing down armies that seemed unstoppable. And yet, time after time, the ancient Israelites walked into battles they had no business winning, and somehow emerged victorious. How did untrained shepherds and farmers defeat the iron chariots of Egypt? How did they conquer fortified cities with walls 40 feet high? How did David, a teenage boy, take down Goliath of Gath with nothing but a sling and a stone the size of a baseball? Here's what's terrifying. While you're sitting there, comfortable, watching this on your phone, there are people around the world right now facing their own giants, their own impossible battles, and they don't have the luxury of scrolling away when things get uncomfortable. If you can't even hit the subscribe button to support content that might actually teach you something valuable about courage, faith, and victory against impossible odds, what does that say about how you face your own battles? Seriously, if this story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things doesn't move you enough to tap that red button, maybe drop a comment below and tell us why you're content staying ordinary. But here's what you need to understand about ancient Israelite warfare. It wasn't just about better strategy or superior weapons. When Joshua faced the walls of Jericho, those walls were 25 feet high and 18 feet thick enough for houses to be built on top of them. Modern siege warfare uses bunker buster bombs, artillery bombardments, and explosive charges. But the Israelites, they walked around those walls for 7 days, blowing ram's horns, and the walls came crashing down. When Moses led 2 million Israelites out of Egypt, Pharaoh's army pursued them with 600 of the finest war chariots in the ancient world, each one a Bronze Age equivalent of a modern battle tank, pulled by trained war horses, manned by elite warriors. The Israelites were trapped, the Red Sea ahead, certain death behind. Today's military would call in air support, deploy amphibious assault vehicles, establish a beachhead. But something far more extraordinary happened that day. But here's what absolutely nobody talks about. What if I told you that the ancient Israelites were never supposed to survive? Not for a single generation, let alone 3,000 years. Look at a map of the ancient Near East. Really look at it. There's a tiny sliver of land, barely 150 miles long and 75 miles wide, sandwiched between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. That's smaller than modern-day New Jersey. And yet, this microscopic piece of real estate sat directly in the crosshairs of every ancient superpower on Earth. To the southwest, the mighty Egyptian Empire, with pharaohs commanding armies of 200,000 soldiers, bronze chariots gleaming like metallic death machines, and monuments so massive they still defy explanation today. To the north and east, the Assyrian Empire, masters of psychological warfare, who perfected the art of impaling entire cities and leaving forests of corpses as warnings. Further east, Babylon, with hanging gardens and siege engines that could reduce fortified walls to rubble. And that's just the superpowers. Because surrounding this tiny nation like wolves circling wounded prey were the Philistines to the west, the Amalekites to the south, the Ammonites and Moabites to the east, and the Canaanites scattered throughout the very land they called home. Each one of these tribes had been forged in the furnace of desert warfare for centuries. Each one wanted the Israelites completely eliminated. Think about this for a moment. If you can't even commit to hitting a subscribe button to learn about the most impossible survival story in human history, how would you handle being outnumbered 50-1 by enemies who want your entire family wiped from existence? If watching a free video about courage and faith is too much effort for you, maybe scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why learning about legendary victory against impossible odds isn't worth 30 seconds of your time. Here's what makes the Israelite situation so terrifying. They weren't warriors. They were escaped slaves. For 400 years, their ancestors had been making bricks for Egyptian pyramids, not wielding swords. When Moses led them out of Egypt in 1446 BCE, they were a nation of farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen walking into a land where the Amalekites had already proven themselves as the first nation to attack them after the Exodus. But here's where it gets truly impossible. The Promised Land wasn't empty. It was occupied by giants. Literally. The Anakim, descendants of Nephilim, were so enormous that the 12 Israelite spies sent to scout the land reported back in terror. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. These weren't metaphorical giants. Archaeological evidence suggests some of these warriors stood over 9 feet tall, wielding weapons that weighed more than most men could carry. And yet, somehow, time after time, the impossible happened. When Joshua approached the fortified city of Jericho, military experts today estimate those walls could have withstood a siege for years. Modern armies would deploy heavy artillery, bunker buster missiles, maybe even tactical nuclear weapons against such fortifications. The Israelites, they walked around the walls for 7 days, blowing ram's horns, and those impenetrable walls collapsed like a house of cards. When Gideon faced the combined armies of the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples, he was outnumbered 45,000 to 300. Those are worse odds than facing a modern army division with nothing but a hunting rifle. But something extraordinary happened that night. But here's what's truly chilling about the ancient Israelite story. Every single battle was existential. There was no retreat. There were no second chances. When they faced the Philistines at Michmash, when they confronted the Ammonites who were gouging out the right eyes of their kinsmen, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem with engines of war that hadn't been seen before, every single defeat meant slavery, exile, or complete annihilation. Every victory meant survival for another generation. Every loss meant the end of everything. This wasn't a chess game played by kings for territory or trade routes. This was a 3,000-year fight for existence against impossible odds, where untrained shepherds repeatedly defeated professional armies, where teenage boys felled giants, where walls collapsed at the sound of trumpets, and where the very survival of an entire people hung in the balance every single day. And the most terrifying question of all, if an ancient nation of former slaves could achieve the impossible against the greatest military powers on earth, what exactly are you capable of when everything is on the line? What exactly does it take to transform 2 million terrified slaves into a nation of warriors? Because that's precisely what happened next, and the answer will shock you. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of the Sinai Desert in 1446 BCE. Behind you lies Egypt, where for 4 centuries your people built pyramids with their bare hands, where babies were thrown into the Nile River, where the crack of the taskmaster's whip was a soundtrack of daily life. Ahead of you stretches an endless wasteland of scorching sand, venomous serpents, and certain death. You have no weapons, no military training, no battle experience whatsoever. You're carrying children, elderly parents, and everything you own on your back. And then, 3 months into this nightmare journey, the Amalekites attack. The battle began with the Amalekites' unprovoked attack against the Israelites at Rephidim. Think about this for a moment. These were professional desert warriors, hardened by generations of tribal warfare, attacking a defenseless caravan of former slaves. It should have been a massacre. It should have been the end of the Israelite story before it even began. But here's where something absolutely impossible happened, and if you can't even commit 40 seconds to hitting that subscribe button to learn about the most incredible military transformation in human history, maybe you should ask yourself what you're actually committed to in life. If a free lesson about turning weakness into unstoppable strength isn't worth your time, scroll down and tell everyone in the comments why learning about legendary courage doesn't interest you. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men, and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." Wait! Joshua? Who was this Joshua? 3 months ago, he was a slave making bricks in Egypt. Now suddenly he is selecting warriors from a nation that had never held a sword? But here's the part that will give you chills. As long as Moses held up his hands on the hilltop, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. This wasn't conventional warfare. This wasn't about superior tactics or better weapons. This was something entirely different. When Moses' arms grew tired, Aaron and her held his hands up one on each side until the sun went down. And Joshua, this former slave-turned-commander, defeated Amalek and its army in battle. But here's what's truly terrifying. This was just the beginning. This first victory against the Amalekites wasn't the end of their transformation. It was a spark that ignited something unstoppable. Because what happened next defies everything we understand about human nature, military training, and the psychology of fear. For the next 40 years, The Israelites wandered in the wilderness until all the nation's men of war who had come out of Egypt had died. 40 years of brutal desert survival. 40 years of constant threat from hostile tribes. 40 years of learning to fight, to survive, to become something they never imagined possible. Think about this transformation. In Egypt, there were brickmakers, potters, farmers. They worked with clay and grain and livestock. Their hands knew the feel of straw and mortar, not the grip of bronze swords and cedar spades. They had spent generations watching the horizon for Egyptian chariots coming to collect them for forced labor, not scanning for enemy armies approaching their camp. But something extraordinary was happening during those 4 decades in the wilderness. Every sunrise brought new dangers. Every sunset brought new lessons in survival. The same hands that once shaped bricks for Pharaoh's monuments were now learning to forge weapons, to build fortifications, to strike with deadly precision. The children who had been born in Egyptian slavery were growing up as warriors. The teenagers who had never seen combat were becoming battle-hardened soldiers. The young men who had fled Egypt in terror were evolving into commanders who would strike fear into the hearts of giants. And here's where the story takes an absolutely chilling turn. By the time that first generation died in the wilderness, something unprecedented had emerged. A nation of former slaves had become a military force unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Not because they had better weapons, not because they had superior numbers, but because they had been forged in the crucible of impossible circumstances into something the world had never witnessed before. But here's the question that should keep you awake at night. If 2 million terrified slaves could transform into legendary warriors through 40 years of impossible circumstances, what could 40 years of your life accomplish if you stopped making excuses and started embracing the impossible? Because what happened when those 40 years ended, when this new generation of desert-forged warriors finally approached the Promised Land, what they accomplished next makes every modern military achievement look like child's play. Why would an unarmed people dare to march toward fortified cities defended by giants? Because they were no longer unarmed, and they were no longer afraid. What happened next will haunt every military strategist who has ever lived, because it breaks every single rule of warfare ever written. Picture the scene. The year is 1400 BCE, and standing before the massive walls of Jericho is an army unlike any the world has ever seen. Not because of their weapons, not because of their armor, but because of what they are not doing. They are not building siege engines. They are not digging tunnels beneath the walls. They are not launching arrows or hurling stones. They are walking, in complete silence, around a city that could annihilate them with a single charge from the gates. The walls of Jericho weren't just impressive, they were impossible. Archaeological evidence reveals these walls were 25 feet high and 18 feet thick. Modern military engineers estimate it would take months of continuous bombardment with heavy artillery to even crack them. The Roman legions, the most advanced siege warfare specialists in history, would have required massive catapults, battering rams, and siege towers to even attempt such an assault. But Joshua's strategy? March around the city once a day for 6 days, 7 times on the 7th day, with priests blowing horns and the people remaining completely silent until the final shout. Think about this for a moment. If you can't even muster the courage to hit a subscribe button to learn about the most impossible military victory in human history, how would you handle being ordered to walk silently around walls that could crush your entire family? If 30 seconds of commitment to free knowledge about legendary courage is too much for you, maybe scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why learning about miraculous victories doesn't move you to action. But here's what makes the Jericho strategy so psychologically devastating. Joshua was attempting to weaken the will of the enemy by playing upon the fear and uncertainty that had already gripped the defenders. Every morning for 6 days, the defenders would wake up, grab their weapons, man the walls, and prepare for a massive assault. Instead, they watched in growing terror as an entire army walked around their city in dead silence, then simply left. Imagine the psychological warfare happening inside those walls. Day 1, they are scouting us. Day 2, they are trying to intimidate us. Day 3, what kind of army marches in silence? Day 4, this isn't normal. Day 5, something's wrong. Day 6, what are they planning? And then came day 7. 7 times they marched around the city. 7 times the priests blew their horns. 7 times the defenders watched in mounting horror as this impossible army completed another circuit in perfect, terrifying silence. And then, when the walls miraculously collapsed, Israel destroyed the city and everything in it, except for Rahab and her family. But here's what absolutely nobody talks about. This victory should have been the end of the story. Jericho was just the beginning. Because what happened to the next city, Ai, reveals something even more chilling about Joshua's military genius. The first assault on Ai was a disaster. Joshua sent only 3,000 men against what seemed like a smaller target, and they were routed. 36 Israelites died, and the entire army fled in terror. It was their first defeat since the wilderness, and it shattered their confidence completely. But Joshua didn't give up. He didn't retreat. Instead, he did something that would become the blueprint for special operations warfare for the next 3 millennia. The strategy was pure genius. One group would pretend to attack the city and then retreat, drawing the defenders out in pursuit. Meanwhile, another group lay in ambush behind the city. When the men of Ai pursued the retreating Israelites, the ambush party entered and set the city on fire. The main Israelite force then turned back and attacked the men of Ai, resulting in a comprehensive victory. This wasn't just revenge. This was the birth of psychological warfare, deception tactics, and coordinated military operations that modern special forces still study today. Joshua had invented the feint, the ambush, and the pincer movement in a single, devastating maneuver. But here's where the story becomes absolutely terrifying. These weren't just isolated victories. From the military camp at Gilgal, Joshua launched 2 campaigns, thus conquering central and southern Canaan. The pattern was brilliant. By capturing Jericho and Ai, they had driven a wedge between the northern and southern sections of Canaan, controlling the central ridge and dividing their enemies. City after city fell, not through superior numbers, not through better weapons, but through strategies so revolutionary that military academies still teach them 3,000 years later. The Gibeonites were so terrified they pretended to be from a distant land just to make peace. The 5 kings of the Amorites formed a desperate alliance and still couldn't stop Joshua's advance. But here's a question that should keep military historians awake at night. How does a former slave become one of the greatest military tacticians in human history? Joshua had 40 years in the wilderness to perfect his strategy for conquering the Promised Land. 40 years of planning, studying, preparing for this moment. And here's what's truly chilling. After 7 years of warfare, the conquest was complete. The most fortified region in the ancient world, defended by giants, protected by iron chariots, surrounded by professional armies, had been systematically dismantled by a nation that 40 years earlier didn't even know how to hold a sword. But here's the question that will haunt you. Were these victories divine miracles or brilliant psychological tactics? Because if human beings can achieve the impossible through faith, strategy, and 40 years of preparation, what exactly are you capable of accomplishing? And here's the part that should terrify every enemy of Israel throughout history. This was just the beginning. Because what Joshua accomplished in Canaan was merely the foundation for what would come next, when shepherd boys would face giants, when 300 men would defeat armies of thousands, when the very survival of civilization would hang in the balance. The conquest of Canaan wasn't just about taking territory. It was about proving that impossible victories are possible when faith meets preparation, when strategy aligns with purpose, and when ordinary people decide to attempt extraordinary things. What happened next will shatter everything you think you know about leadership, warfare, and human potential, because the greatest military minds in Israel's history weren't generals, weren't professional soldiers, weren't even men half the time. Picture this scene. The year is 1125 BCE, and sitting under a palm tree in the hill country of Ephraim is a woman settling legal disputes between farmers and shepherds. Her name is Deborah, and by all ancient standards, she should have been invisible to history. Women in the ancient Near East weren't judges. They weren't military commanders. They weren't supposed to lead nations into battle against iron chariots and professional armies. And yet, when the Canaanite king Jabin with his 900 iron chariots had brutally oppressed Israel for 20 years, when his commander Sisera had turned the northern territories into a wasteland of fear, it was Deborah who would orchestrate one of the most brilliant military victories in ancient history. But here's what absolutely nobody talks about. Deborah didn't just defeat Sisera's army. She psychologically destroyed them using a strategy so revolutionary that military academies still study it 3,000 years later. The setup was genius. Deborah summoned Barak to take 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun up Mount Tabor, deliberately drawing Sisera's forces to the Kishon River Valley. But when Barak hesitated, demanding that Deborah accompany him into battle, she made prediction that would haunt Sisera forever. I will surely go with thee. Notwithstanding the journey that thou takest shall not be for thy honor, for the Lord will give Sisera over into the hand of a woman. If you can't even summon the courage to hit a subscribe button to learn about the most impossible military victories led by history's most unlikely heroes, how would you handle being chosen to lead 10,000 men against 900 iron chariots? If 30 seconds of commitment to understanding legendary leadership is beyond your capability, maybe scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why learning about courage from a woman who changed the course of nations doesn't inspire you to action. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. Barak descended Mount Tabor with 10,000 men, and Sisera's entire army was completely defeated and pursued as far as Harosheth-Goyim. But Sisera himself escaped on foot, running for his life toward what he thought was safety. That's when the most chilling part of Deborah's prophecy came true. Sisera was killed by Jael, who hammered a tent peg into his temple while he slept. The most feared military commander in Canaan, the terror of the northern tribes, the man whose iron chariots had crushed every opposition for 20 years, was killed by a woman with a tent peg and a hammer. But if Deborah's victory seems impossible, what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about military strategy. The year is 1162 BCE, and crouched in a wine press, secretly threshing wheat to hide it from Midianite raiders, is a young farmer named Gideon. For 7 years, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples had swarmed across Israel like locusts, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock, and reducing the Israelites to hiding in caves and strongholds. The enemy force was staggering. 135,000 Midianite warriors had gathered in the valley of Jezreel, a massive army that stretched beyond the horizon. Against this overwhelming force, Gideon initially gathered 32,000 Israelites, still outnumbered more than 4 to 1. But then something absolutely insane happened. God told Gideon his army was too large. Too large. The Lord commanded Gideon to reduce his army to only 300 men. That meant facing 135,000 professional desert raiders with 300 farmers and shepherds. The odds? 450 to 1. Let that sink in for a moment. If modern military strategists faced those odds, they would call it suicide. If a general today proposed attacking a massive enemy force with such a ridiculously small army, he would be court-martialed for insanity. But Gideon wasn't insane. He was terrified. So terrified that he asked God for 2 signs using a fleece. First, that the fleece would be wet while the ground remained dry. Then that the fleece would be dry while the ground was wet. Only after these miraculous confirmations did he find the courage to proceed. The strategy was pure psychological warfare genius. Divided into 3 companies, Gideon and his 300 men surrounded the enemy camp at night, then simultaneously blew trumpets, smashed clay jars to reveal torches, and gave battle cries, simulating an attack by a massive force. The result? The entire Midianite army fled in panic. In the darkness and confusion, they couldn't tell how large the attacking force was. The sound of 300 trumpets suggested 300 companies, potentially 30,000 to 90,000 attackers. The sudden explosion of light and noise in the pre-dawn darkness created the illusion of being surrounded by an overwhelming force. But here's the most chilling part. Gideon's 300 men destroyed a Midianite army that outnumbered them 450 to 1. This wasn't just victory. This was a complete annihilation of one of the largest armies in ancient Middle Eastern history by a force smaller than a modern infantry company. And if you think that's impossible, wait until you hear about Samson. The year is 1075 BCE, and the Philistines have dominated Israel for decades with their superior iron weapons, professional armies, and strategic coastal cities. They control the trade routes, the weapon manufacturing, and most of the fertile land. The Israelites are reduced to farmers and shepherds, forbidden from forging iron tools or weapons. Into this hopeless situation steps the most unlikely warrior in Israel's history, a man whose entire military strategy consisted of individual acts of what can only be described as supernatural guerrilla warfare. Samson didn't lead armies. He didn't command troops. He was a one-man psychological terror campaign against the entire Philistine military establishment. When they sent 3,000 men to capture him, he killed 1,000 of them with the jawbone of a donkey. When they cornered him in Gaza, he tore the city gate from their foundations and carried them to the top of a mountain. But here's what makes Samson's story so terrifying. He was fighting a war that nobody else could win. The Philistines had iron weapons. The Israelites had bronze and stone. The Philistines had professional armies. The Israelites had farmers. The Philistines had fortified cities. The Israelites had villages. And yet, through sheer individual prowess, Samson single-handedly held an entire enemy nation in check for 20 years. He was judge over Israel for 2 decades, not because he led armies, but because he was so dangerous that the Philistines couldn't expand their territory while he lived. But the most chilling part of Samson's story is how it ended. Betrayed by Delilah, blinded and enslaved, forced to grind grain like an animal in a Philistine prison. His final act was to position himself between the 2 main pillars supporting the Temple of Dagon, push with all his remaining strength, and collapse the entire structure on himself and thousands of Philistines. In death, Samson killed more Philistines than he had killed during his entire lifetime. His suicide attack was so devastating that it broke Philistine power for an entire generation. But here's the question that should haunt every military historian. Why did Israel's weakest often become its greatest warriors? Deborah was a woman in a culture that excluded women from warfare. Gideon was a coward who threshed wheat in hiding. Samson was a slave who spent his final years grinding grain in a prison. And yet, each of them achieved military victories that professional generals with superior armies couldn't accomplish. Each of them faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. Each of them used strategies so revolutionary that we still study them today. The answer is terrifying, because if unlikely heroes can achieve the impossible against overwhelming odds, if women can outsmart iron chariots, if cowards can become legendary commanders, if slaves can bring down empires, then what exactly is your excuse? What impossible victory are you walking away from because you don't think you're qualified? What enemy are you refusing to face because you don't feel strong enough? What walls are you avoiding because you don't believe they can fall? Because the pattern is clear. Israel's greatest victories came not from their strongest warriors, but from their most unlikely heroes. Not from those who felt qualified, but from those who felt called. Not from those who had every advantage, but from those who had nothing left to lose. What happens when a king chosen by God turns into history's most tragic military commander? What you're about to discover will chill you to the bone, because the rise and fall of King Saul is the most terrifying lesson in leadership, warfare, and the price of losing divine favor ever recorded. Picture this scene. The year is 1050 BCE, and for the first time in Israel's history, they had demanded a king like all the other nations. Not because they wanted better leadership, but because they were tired of being different. They were tired of depending on unlikely heroes and divine intervention. They wanted professional armies, standing forces, organized warfare. God gave them exactly what they asked for, and it nearly destroyed them. King Saul stood head and shoulders above every man in Israel. He was a perfect physical specimen for ancient warfare, tall, powerful, commanding. When he was anointed king, he had everything needed to lead Israel to unprecedented military dominance. The Spirit of God came upon him with power. The people rallied behind him with enthusiasm. His first victory against the Ammonites at Jabesh-Gilead was so decisive that Israel's enemies trembled at the mention of his name. But here's what absolutely nobody talks about. Saul didn't just create Israel's first professional army. He revolutionized ancient Middle Eastern warfare by establishing the first organized military infrastructure in Israelite history. For the first time, Israel had a standing army. For the first time, they had professional soldiers instead of farmer warriors called up for specific battles. For the first time, they had military ranks, chain of command, strategic planning, and coordinated campaigns. War with the Philistines was fierce for all the days of Saul, and whenever he noticed any strong or brave man, Saul would enlist him. This was military conscription on a scale Israel had never seen. Saul wasn't just fighting battles, he was building a war machine. But if you think the transformation from judges to organized monarchy sound impressive, wait until you hear what happened when that system began to crumble. Because the most terrifying military disasters in Israel's history happened not when they were weak, but when their king lost the favor of the God who had given him victory. If you can't even commit 30 seconds to hitting a subscribe button to learn about the most tragic military collapse in ancient history, how would you handle watching everything you've built fall apart because you made one wrong decision at the worst possible moment? If learning about the catastrophic consequences of losing divine support isn't worth your time, scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why understanding the price of disobedience doesn't concern you. The beginning of Saul's downfall started with a single act of impatience at Gilgal. Samuel was supposed to arrive to offer the burnt offering before battle, but when he was delayed, Saul's men began scattering. The Philistines were ready for battle at Michmash, so Saul felt compelled to offer the burnt offering himself. It seemed like a reasonable military decision. It seemed like practical leadership under pressure. It seemed like the kind of decisive action that wins battles. But Samuel's response was chilling. How foolish! You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. One moment of impatience, one act of taking matters into his own hands, one decision to prioritize military expediency over divine command, and Saul's entire dynasty was finished before it really began. But here's what makes Saul's story so psychologically terrifying. Even after losing divine favor, he continued to win battles. Together with his son Jonathan and an army composed largely of volunteers, he won significant victories over the Philistines and succeeded in driving them out of the Central Hills. A successful campaign against the Amalekites in the south is also recorded. For years, it seemed like nothing had changed. Saul was still king. His armies were still victorious. His enemies were still falling before him. The success masked the spiritual cancer that was eating away at his kingship from the inside. And that's when the truly chilling part began. Because while Saul was building his military empire, somewhere in the hills of Judah, a teenage shepherd boy named David was being secretly anointed as the next king of Israel. The collision caused between the king who had lost divine favor and the boy who would replace him was about to create the most dramatic military confrontation in ancient history. But before that showdown, something even more terrifying happened. At the Battle of Michmash, Jonathan, Saul's son, achieved one of the most impossible military victories in Israel's history, defeating an entire Philistine army with just his armor-bearer. When Saul and his army arrived at the battle, they found total confusion, Philistines swinging their swords wildly, killing each other. Think about this for a moment. Saul's son was achieving victories that rivaled Gideon and Samson, while Saul himself was slowly descending into the madness of a king fighting against God's will. The next generation was already proving they had what it took to lead Israel, while the current king was proving he had lost what he needed to survive. But the most chilling aspect of Saul's reign wasn't his military failures. It was his military successes achieved without divine blessing. Because what's more terrifying than losing a battle? Winning battles while losing your soul. For almost 40 years, Saul ruled Israel with an iron fist. His standing army became the most organized military force in the region. His strategic planning and battlefield tactics were studied and copied by surrounding nations. His professional soldiers were feared from Egypt to Mesopotamia. But underneath the surface, something catastrophic was happening. The king who had been chosen by God was slowly becoming God's enemy. The man who had once prophesied with the prophets was now plotting to murder the boy who would replace him. The commander who had united the 12 tribes was now dividing them through paranoia, jealousy, and rage. And here's where the story becomes absolutely haunting. Before his final battle at Mount Gilboa, Saul consulted the witch Endor, seeking supernatural guidance after God had stopped answering his prayers. The king who had once banned witchcraft from Israel was now secretly practicing it himself. The medium conjured up the spirit of Samuel, and the dead prophet's message was more terrifying than any enemy army. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, and the Lord will give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Imagine the psychological terror of receiving a death sentence from beyond the grave. Imagine knowing with absolute certainty that your next battle would be your last. Imagine facing an enemy army while knowing that the God who had given you every previous victory had now abandoned you to defeat. The Battle of Mount Gilboa was a massacre. Saul's sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishu were killed in battle. The army that had dominated the region for decades was utterly routed. Saul himself, severely wounded by Philistine archers and facing capture, fell on his own sword rather than be taken alive. But here's the most chilling part. The Philistines found Saul's body, stripped off his armor as a trophy, put it in the temple of Ashtoreth, and nailed his dismembered body to the walls of Bethshan. The king who had been chosen to lead God's people ended up as a trophy in a pagan temple. What happens when a king loses the favor of the God who leads his armies? Everything falls apart. Not gradually, not partially, but completely and catastrophically. The strongest military infrastructure in Israel's history collapsed in a single day because a man at the top had forgotten that victory comes from above, not from within. But here's the question that should terrify every leader, every parent, every person with responsibility for others. If King Saul, chosen by God, anointed by Samuel, gifted with supernatural power and military genius, could lose everything through disobedience, what makes you think you're immune? What divine favor are you taking for granted? What spiritual disciplines are you neglecting while focusing on building your earthly empire? What moment of impatience or compromise is slowly eating away at the foundation of everything you've built? Because Saul's story isn't just ancient history, it's a warning. Success without divine blessing is just delayed catastrophe. Military might without spiritual foundation is just organized weakness. And the higher you rise without God's favor, the more devastating your fall will be. What happens when a shepherd boy with a sling becomes history's greatest military genius? What you're about to discover will forever change how you think about leadership, loyalty, and the power of impossible faith. Because David's story isn't just about defeating giants. It's about building an empire through the deadliest secret weapon in ancient warfare. Picture this scene. The Valley of Elah, 1025 BCE. For 40 days, the armies of Israel and Philistia have faced each other across this narrow valley, neither side daring to attack. The Philistines hold the high ground on one side, the Israelites cower on the other, and every morning, a 9-foot-tall giant named Goliath storms into the valley, his bronze armor weighing 125 pounds, his spear tip alone 15 pounds of iron death. Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. Goliath's voice echoes across the valley like thunder. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. For 40 days, every warrior in Saul's army trembled at this challenge. Professional soldiers who had faced death 100 times couldn't muster the courage to step forward. These were men who had conquered cities, who had routed enemy armies, who had built their reputations on the battlefield, and they were paralyzed by fear. And then, a teenage shepherd boy arrived with lunch for his brothers. David heard Goliath's blasphemous challenge and asked a question that revealed something extraordinary about his character. What shall be done for the man who kills his Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? If you can't even summon the courage to hit a subscribe button to learn about the most impossible victory in military history, how would you handle facing a 9-foot giant when every professional warrior around you is trembling in terror? If 30 seconds of commitment to understanding legendary courage is too much for you, scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why learning from history's greatest underdog victory doesn't inspire you to action. But here's what absolutely nobody talks about. David's victory over Goliath wasn't about superior weaponry or physical strength. It was about a revolutionary understanding of warfare that would transform him from a shepherd into an emperor. When David stepped forward to face Goliath, King Saul offered him armor and weapons. David tried them on and took them off. He chose instead 5 smooth stones from the brook in his shepherd's sling. To every military expert watching, David had just committed suicide. But David understood something that professional warriors have forgotten. Battles aren't won by the biggest weapon or the strongest armor. They are won by speed, precision, and absolute confidence in your cause. David, with just 5 stones in a sling, faced a giant Goliath who was heavily armed. The young shepherd, drawing his strength from his faith in God, shot the rock into the center of the giant's forehead, knocking him down, then took his sword and cut off his head. The psychological impact was devastating. The Philistine army, which had been supremely confident behind their champion, watched in horror as their invincible giant fell face first into the date, killed by a boy they could barely see across the valley. They fled in complete panic, and Israel's army, suddenly transformed from cowards into heroes, pursued them all the way to the gates of Gath. But here's where David's story becomes truly chilling, because the victory over Goliath wasn't the end of his military genius. It was just the beginning. Over the next decade, while serving in Saul's army, David won every single battle he fought. Not most of them. Not the majority. Every single one. The narrative signified King Saul's unfitness to rule as David's success exposed a spiritual vacuum at the heart of Saul's kingdom. But when Saul's jealousy forced David to flee into the wilderness, something extraordinary happened. The cave of Adullam became a magnet for every desperate, indebted, and discontented person in Israel. 400 men gathered around David, and he transformed them into the most feared military unit in the ancient world. These weren't professional soldiers. They were outcasts, debtors, fugitives. They were men who had lost everything and had nowhere else to go. But under David's leadership, they became something unprecedented in military history, the mighty men. While there, David expresses a heartfelt desire for water from a well near Bethlehem, which the narrative states was occupied by Philistines. The 3 of the 30 therefore forcefully break past the Philistines and draw water from the well, which they take back to David. David refuses to drink the water, instead pouring it out before Yahweh, arguing that it was the blood of the men who had risked their lives. Think about the psychology of this moment. 3 men risked their lives to break through enemy lines and bring their commander a drink of water. Not because he ordered them to, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because they loved him so much that his casual wish became their life-and-death mission. That's not military discipline. That's devotion so intense it borders on worship. And David's response, pouring out the water as an offering rather than drinking it, showed why men were willing to die for him. He valued their lives more than his own desires. But the mighty men weren't just loyal, they were legendary warriors. Abishai, the brother of Job, he was chief of the 30 and once came to David's rescue when he was nearly killed by a giant Philistine warrior named Ishbi-benob, and killed 300 men with a spear. These men didn't just fight for David, they became extensions of his tactical genius. When he became king, they became his instrument for conquering an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates River. David subdued the people of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Philistia, Amalek, and Zobah. Israel's army, under the command of Abishai, struck down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt, and the Edomite became servants to the Israelites. The Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. But here's what makes David's military campaign so psychologically terrifying. He wasn't just conquering territory. He was systematically destroying every enemy that had ever threatened Israel's existence. He smote and subdued the Philistines and destroyed the independence of their chief town Gath. He invaded Moab, slew the greater part of the soldiers, and imposed upon the people a heavy tribute. The same Philistines who had terrorized Israel with Goliath were reduced to vassals. The same Moabites who had oppressed the judges were crushed under David's heel. Abishai and his brother Job were able to defeat a two-front engagement against the Ammonites and their Syrian mercenaries. In this account, Job divided his forces into 2 divisions, placing Abishai in command of the forces engaging the Ammonites while he faced the Syrians. This wasn't just victory, this was tactical perfection on multiple fronts simultaneously. But here's the question that should haunt every military historian. Was David's greatest weapon his sling or his strategy? Because while everyone focuses on the stone that killed Goliath, the real secret of David's success was something far more dangerous. David understood that wars aren't won by weapons, they are won by hearts. His ability to inspire absolute loyalty, to transform outcasts into heroes, to make men willing to die not just for a cause but for him personally, that was his true secret weapon. When David's men faced impossible odds, they didn't just fight for Israel. They didn't just fight for victory. They fought for a king who would pour out water rather than drink what they had bled to bring him. They fought for a leader who had started as an outcast just like them. But here's what's truly chilling about David's story. He built the greatest empire in Israel's history using the same men that society had thrown away. Debtors became generals. Fugitives became administrators. Outcasts became the foundation of a dynasty that would last forever. Zelek the Ammonite, Ithma the Moabite, and Uriah the Hittite appear to have been from pagan nations. David's inner circle included former enemies who became more loyal to him than men born in Israel. And here's the question that should terrify every leader who thinks success comes from having the right resources, the perfect plan, or the ideal circumstances. If David could build an empire with society's rejects, if he could conquer the ancient world with men nobody else wanted, if he could inspire loyalty so intense that warriors would die for a casual wish, what exactly is your excuse? What army of overlooked people are you ignoring because they don't fit your picture of success? What outcasts could become your greatest assets if you had the vision to see their potential? What impossible victory are you walking away from because you're waiting for better resources instead of building with what you have? Because David's legacy proves the most terrifying truth in leadership. Your greatest weapon isn't your strategy, your resources, or your circumstances. Your greatest weapon is your ability to make others believe that following you is worth dying for. What happens when the bloodiest empire in ancient history suddenly stops fighting and starts negotiating? What you're about to discover will shatter everything you think you know about power, peace, and the price of prosperity, because Solomon's transformation from warrior to diplomat created the most dangerous experiment in human history. Picture this scene. The year is 970 BCE, and the throne of Israel has just passed from David, the warrior king who built an empire with blood and bronze, to his son Solomon, a 20-year-old who has never commanded an army, never faced an enemy in battle, never killed a man in combat. The empire David carved out with his sword now stretches from Egypt to the Euphrates River. Every neighboring nation trembles at the mention of Israel's name. The mighty men who once followed David into impossible battles are still alive, still dangerous, still ready for war. But Solomon makes a decision that will either secure Israel's future forever or destroy everything his father died to build. Instead of leading armies into battle, he sends ambassadors bearing gifts. Instead of conquering new territories, he negotiates trade agreements. Instead of ruling through fear, he chooses to rule through wisdom and wealth. And for 40 years, this impossible gamble actually worked. But here's what absolutely nobody talks about. Solomon's shift from warfare to diplomacy wasn't just a change in strategy. It was the most radical experiment in ancient geopolitics ever attempted. And the methods he used to maintain peace were so controversial, so psychologically complex, that they would ultimately tear his empire apart from the inside. If you can't even commit 30 seconds to hitting a subscribe button to learn about the most dangerous peace treaty in ancient history, how would you handle making decisions that could either secure your legacy forever or destroy everything your ancestors died to build? If learning about the catastrophic consequences of choosing prosperity over principle isn't worth your time, scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why understanding the price of peace doesn't concern you. The foundation of Solomon's diplomatic revolution was built on something that would have horrified every previous generation of Israelites: political marriages with enemy nations. His marriage to Pharaoh's daughter appears to have cemented political alliance with Egypt, the same Egypt that had enslaved the Israelites for 4 centuries, the same Egypt whose armies had pursued them to the Red Sea. Think about the psychological impact of this decision. Solomon was inviting the daughter of Pharaoh, descendant of the gods who had oppressed his people, into the very heart of Jerusalem. He was sleeping with the enemy, literally. And this wasn't a moment of weakness or political miscalculation. This was deliberate strategy. But Pharaoh's daughter was just the beginning. Solomon would eventually accumulate 700 wives and 300 concubines, most of them from nations that Israel had been commanded to destroy: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. Every one of these marriages was a diplomatic treaty written in flesh and blood. The results were immediate and terrifying. For the first time in Israel's history, there was peace. Complete, total, absolute peace. No invasions, no sieges, no desperate battles for survival. The same nations that had been trying to annihilate Israel for centuries were now sending their daughters to marry the king and their sons to study at his court. But here's where Solomon's story becomes truly chilling, because this peace came with a price that would make David's blood-soaked conquest look like mercy. To fund his diplomatic empire, Solomon imposed forced labor on his own people. For the first time in Israel's history, there began to be a distinct difference between rich and poor. The king and his household were rich, the common people were poor. The same people who had once been equal under God's law were now divided into classes like a pagan empire. When Solomon gave orders to build a temple for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself, he wasn't just constructing buildings, he was creating the most ambitious construction project in ancient history. Solomon's greatest achievement was the building of the temple in Jerusalem, which is meticulously related in 1 Kings 5-7. The temple took 7 years to complete. It was built of stone and cedar, carved within and overlaid with pure gold. But the construction required something unprecedented: international partnerships with former enemies. When Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, Hiram sent envoys to Solomon because he had always been on friendly terms with David. These alliances were instrumental in acquiring the necessary materials and skilled labor, stimulating the economy, and establishing Israel's position as a major regional power. The psychological transformation was staggering. The same Israelites who had once lived in tents were now building palaces that made Egyptian monuments look simple. The same people who had carried the Ark of the Covenant on poles were now housing it in a temple covered with enough gold to purchase entire kingdoms. But here's what makes Solomon's diplomatic revolution so psychologically terrifying. It was working so well that neighboring rulers came from across the known world just to witness what he had accomplished. The Queen of Sheba travels to Jerusalem, probably making an overland round trip of 2,800 miles. She came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices, and very much gold and precious stones. Think about this for a moment. A foreign queen traveled nearly 3,000 miles across desert wasteland just to see if the reports about Solomon's wisdom and wealth were true. When she arrived, she was so overwhelmed by what she saw that she told Solomon, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me." This wasn't just diplomatic success. This was unprecedented soft power projection. Solomon had transformed Israel from a military threat into a cultural magnet. Instead of conquering nations, he was attracting their best and brightest to come learn from him voluntarily. Hiram and Solomon engaged in shipbuilding and trade, especially trade in lumber and gold. For the first time in Israel's history, they weren't just surviving, they were prosperous beyond imagination. Trade routes that had been closed by warfare were now open for business. Resources that had been consumed by constant military campaigns were now flowing into construction, education, and technological advancement. But here's the question that should haunt every leader who has ever chosen short-term prosperity over long-term principle. Could peace last in a land surrounded by war? Because while Solomon was building his diplomatic empire through political marriages and trade agreements, something else was happening. The biblical narrative notes with disapproval that Solomon permitted his foreign wives to import their national deities, building temples to Ashtoreth and Milcom. Not only did the Torah forbid marriages with Egyptians, but it also forbade making treaties, agreements, or dealings of any kind with Egyptians. Every diplomatic success was simultaneously a spiritual compromise. Every trade agreement was also an invitation to idol worship. Every political marriage was also a betrayal of the covenant that had given Israel their strength in the first place. And here's what's truly chilling about Solomon's story. The same wisdom that made him the greatest diplomat in ancient history also made him the most dangerous king Israel ever had. Because while he was securing peace through compromise, he was simultaneously destroying the very foundation that had made Israel unconquerable. When Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, Gabriel descended and stuck a reed in the sea, which gathered a sandbank around it, on which was built the great city of Rome. According to ancient tradition, Solomon's compromise with Egypt was the beginning of the empire that would eventually destroy Jerusalem. But here's the question that should terrify every leader who thinks success can be maintained without principle. Was Solomon's greatest achievement his temple, his wealth, his wisdom, or his tragic example of what happens when you trade your identity for temporary peace? Because Solomon's legacy proves the most terrifying truth about leadership. You can win every negotiation, secure every alliance, build every monument, and accumulate every treasure. But if you lose your soul in the process, you lost everything that actually mattered. And the empire that took David 40 years to build through impossible faith and legendary courage, Solomon lost it in a single generation through compromise, comfort, and a catastrophic belief that peace could be purchased instead of preserved. What happens when the greatest empire in ancient history tears itself apart in a single conversation? What you're about to witness will horrify you, because the collapse of Solomon's kingdom wasn't caused by foreign invasion, devastating plague, or natural disaster. It was destroyed by one foolish king, one moment of pride, and the most catastrophic family feud in human history. Picture this scene. The year is 930 BCE, and the location is Shechem, the ancient gathering place of the 12 tribes. Solomon has just died, and his son Rehoboam has come to be crowned king of the entire Israelite empire. The representatives of all 12 tribes are assembled, but their mood is dark. For 40 years, they have endured crushing taxation to fund Solomon's building projects. For 40 years, they have provided forced labor to construct palaces and temples. For 40 years, they have watched their wealth flow to Jerusalem while their own children went hungry. Their spokesman is Jeroboam, a former overseer of Solomon's labor force who had fled to Egypt after attempting rebellion years earlier. His words of the new king are measured, respectful, almost pleading. Your father put a heavy yoke on us. But now, lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. It was the simplest request in political history. Lower the taxes, reduce the forced labor, show mercy to your people, and they will follow you forever. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consider this request. The older advisors, men who had served Solomon for decades, gave him counsel that could have secured his dynasty for 1,000 years. If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a good answer, they will be your servants forever. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders and instead consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. Their counsel was catastrophic. Tell these people, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. If you can't even commit 30 seconds to hitting a subscribe button to learn about the most devastating political miscalculation in ancient history, how would you handle making decisions that could either unite an empire or tear it apart forever? If learning about the catastrophic consequences of pride and foolish counsel isn't worth your time, scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why understanding the price of arrogance doesn't concern you. But here's what makes this moment so psychologically terrifying. Rehoboam's response wasn't just political stupidity. It was a fulfillment of divine judgment. Because while Rehoboam was choosing pride over wisdom, forces beyond human control were already in motion to tear apart everything his grandfather David had died to build. The reaction was immediate and explosive. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel! Look now to your own house, David." In a single moment, the empire that had stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates River was shattered. 10 tribes declared independence under Jeroboam's leadership, forming the northern kingdom of Israel. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam in the south, creating the kingdom of Judah. But here's where the story becomes truly chilling, because civil war was just the beginning of Israel's nightmare. External enemies, who had trembled before Solomon's unified kingdom, now saw opportunity in the division. And the first to strike was the most dangerous enemy Israel had ever faced. Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt had been waiting for exactly this moment. He had sheltered Jeroboam during his exile, probably planning this invasion for years. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak king of Egypt attacked Jerusalem. He came up with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, and innumerable were the people who came with him from Egypt. Think about the psychological impact of this invasion. Shishak wasn't just attacking a weakened kingdom. He was systematically destroying everything Solomon had built. The same Egypt that had sent Pharaoh's daughter to marry Solomon in peace was now sending armies to plunder his treasures in war. Shishak captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shield Solomon had made. The temple that had taken 7 years to build, covered with enough gold to purchase entire kingdoms, was stripped bare by Egyptian raiders in a matter of days. But the most terrifying part wasn't what Shishak took. It was what his invasion revealed about the divided kingdom's complete helplessness. Archaeological evidence from the Bubastite portal at Karnak shows that Shishak attacked scattered cities throughout both nations, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. He wasn't just conquering territory, he was demonstrating that both kingdoms were now too weak to defend themselves. While Egypt was plundering the south, other enemies were already moving against the north. Ben-Hadad of Aram had been contained by Solomon's diplomatic genius, but now he saw opportunity in Israel's civil war. The northern kingdom, which controlled the most fertile agricultural land and the most important trade routes, became his primary target. The kingdom of Aram under Ben-Hadad would become Israel's most persistent enemy, launching invasion after invasion, siege after siege, until the northern kingdom was exhausted by constant warfare. What had once been the strongest region of Solomon's empire became a battlefield where brother fought brother while foreign enemies grew stronger every year. But here's what makes a divided kingdom period so psychologically horrifying. It wasn't just two nations fighting external enemies. There was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Brothers were literally killing brothers while their common enemies prepared to destroy them both. Think about the strategic insanity of the situation. Instead of combining their forces against Egypt, Aram, and the growing threat of Assyria, the two kingdoms were wasting their strength fighting each other. Every soldier who died in civil war was a soldier who couldn't defend against invasion. Every resource spent on fraternal conflict was a resource unavailable for national defense. And the most chilling part of the divided kingdom story is how perfectly it fulfilled every enemy's strategic dream. When brothers fight, enemies grow stronger. Egypt didn't need to conquer both kingdoms simultaneously. They could plunder one while the other was distracted by civil war. Aram didn't need to face the combined armies of 12 tribes. They could defeat the northern kingdom while the southern kingdom watched from across the border. The Assyrians, watching from their strongholds in Mesopotamia, were already planning the invasions that would eventually destroy both kingdoms. They understood what the Israelites had forgotten. A house divided against itself cannot stand, especially when the house is surrounded by enemies who have been waiting centuries for exactly this moment of weakness. But here's a question that should haunt every leader, every family, every organization that has ever faced external threats while fighting internal battles. How many enemies are you empowering through your own division? How many opportunities are you creating for those who want to see you fail by spending your strength fighting those who should be your allies? Because a divided kingdom proves the most terrifying truth about conflict. Your greatest enemy isn't the one attacking from outside. Your greatest enemy is the pride, stubbornness, and foolish counsel that tears you apart from within, leaving you defenseless against external threats that never would have dared attack you while you were united. Solomon's empire, which had intimidated every surrounding nation for 40 years, collapsed not because it was conquered, but because it chose destruction over compromise, pride over wisdom, civil war over unity. And once that choice was made, every enemy they had ever faced came rushing in to claim their piece of the ruins. What happens when the most ruthless empire in ancient history sets its sights on a nation already tearing itself apart? What you're about to witness will chill you to the bone, because the Assyrian conquest of Israel wasn't just military defeat. It was a systematic erasure of 10 entire tribes from human history. And it all began with one terrifying name: Tiglath-Pileser III. Picture this scene. The year is 745 BCE, and from the palaces of Nineveh, a new emperor has ascended the throne of Assyria. His name strikes terror into every kingdom from Egypt to Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser III isn't just another conqueror. He's the architect of the most sophisticated military machine the ancient world has ever seen. His armies don't just defeat enemies, they erase them from existence. While Israel and Judah are still wasting their strength fighting each other, this Assyrian emperor is methodically planning their destruction. He has already conquered Syria, establishing the provinces of Calania, Hatterika, and Samarra. He has systematically dismantled the Syro-Hittite kingdoms that had stood for centuries, and now he's turning his attention south, toward the divided kingdoms that were once Solomon's empire. But here's what makes Tiglath-Pileser III so psychologically terrifying. He doesn't just conquer nations, he perfects the art of making them disappear forever. If you can't even summon the courage to hit a subscribe button to learn about the most systematic genocide in ancient history, how would you handle watching everything your ancestors built being methodically erased from existence? If 30 seconds of commitment to understanding the darkest chapter in Israel's history isn't worth your time, scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why learning about the fate of 10 lost tribes doesn't move you to action. The Assyrian strategy was devastatingly simple. First, demand tribute. Around 738 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser demanded and received tribute from Damascus, the capital of Syria, and Samaria, the capital of Israel. King Menahem of Israel paid 1,000 talents of silver, approximately 37 tons of pure silver, just to keep Assyria from invading. But 4 years later, when the Syrian states rebelled against this crushing tribute, Tiglath-Pileser moved with the efficiency of a machine designed for annihilation. Damascus was conquered and stripped bare. Part of Israel's territory was seized and turned into Assyrian provinces. And then came the most chilling part of the Assyrian system. The deportations began. In 732 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser carried away captive the populations of Galilee and Transjordan. Archaeological evidence shows that entire tribes vanished during these deportations. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, Dan, and Naphtali are never again mentioned in historical records. They didn't just lose their land, they lost their identity, their culture, their very existence as distinct peoples. But this was only the beginning of Israel's nightmare, because what happened next would make Tiglath-Pileser's deportations look like mercy. Shalmaneser V ascended the Assyrian throne in 727 BCE, and his attention immediately focused on the remaining territories of the northern kingdom. King Hoshea of Israel, who had been installed as an Assyrian puppet ruler, made the fatal mistake of proclaiming himself independent and seeking alliance with Egypt. The Assyrian response was swift and merciless. Shalmaneser marched against Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom, and began what will become one of the most devastating sieges in ancient history. For 3 years, the Assyrian army surrounded Samaria, cutting off all supplies, all reinforcement, all hope of rescue. Think about the psychological horror of this siege. For 3 years, the people of Samaria watched their children starve while Assyrian catapults hurled death over their walls. For 3 years, they prayed for rescue that never came. For 3 years, they held on to hope that Egypt would send armies, that Judah would send help, that somehow they could survive what no other city had ever survived. But in 722 BCE, after 3 years of unimaginable suffering, the walls were finally breached. Sargon II, who had succeeded Shalmaneser V, completed the conquest and undertook the most systematic destruction of a people ever recorded in ancient history. The Nimrod prism of Sargon II contains his chilling claim: I besieged and conquered Samaria, led away as booty 27,290 inhabitants of it. But the deportation numbers tell only part of the story, because Sargon didn't just remove people. He replaced them. The king of Assyria took Samaria, and carried Israel away unto Syria, and placed them in Halah and in Habor on the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. In 722 BCE, Assyria conquered the kingdom of Israel and deported many of the residents of Samaria and its surroundings to other Assyrian provinces, and brought deportees from other conquered territories to Samaria to take their place. This wasn't just conquest. This was a complete replacement of an entire population. Assyrian policy was designed to prevent rebellion by destroying the very concept of national identity. The Israelites were scattered across the empire, mixed with other conquered peoples, forbidden from maintaining their customs, their language, their religion. Meanwhile, foreigners from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim were settled in Samaria to replace the deported Israelites. These newcomers brought their own gods, their own customs, their own languages. Within a generation, the northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist not just politically, but culturally and ethnically. But here's what makes the Assyrian conquest so absolutely chilling. It worked perfectly. The 10 northern tribes became what history calls the lost tribes of Israel. Unlike the southern kingdom of Judah, whose people maintained their identity even during exile in Babylon, the northern tribes disappeared completely from human history. The tradition of the Samaritan people states that much of the population remained in place after the Assyrian captivity, but archaeological evidence tells a different story. During the earlier Assyrian invasions, Galilee and Transjordan experienced significant deportations, with entire tribes vanishing. A large depopulation process took place that left the region virtually empty. And here's the most terrifying part of the Assyrian system. It wasn't random violence or uncontrolled destruction. It was planned, methodical, systematic erasure. Over 6,000 ungrateful citizens were deported to Syria to rebuild destroyed settlements. Populations were shuffled across the empire like chess pieces, deliberately mixed and relocated to prevent any possibility of cultural survival or rebellion. But here's the question that should haunt every person who has ever taken their identity, their culture, their very existence for granted. Was this the end of God's people, or just the beginning of a darker chapter? Because while 10 tribes disappeared into the mists of history, 2 tribes in the southern kingdom watched in horror from across the border. Judah and Benjamin saw the complete annihilation of their brothers and realized they were next. The same Assyrian war machine that had erased Israel was already planning the conquest of Jerusalem. And yet, somehow, against all odds, against all logic, against all historical precedent, the southern kingdom would survive what the northern kingdom could not. Not because they were stronger, not because they were more faithful, but because they were about to experience the most impossible military miracle in ancient history. The question isn't whether Assyria could conquer Judah. The question is why they didn't. Because what happened when Sennacherib's army surrounded Jerusalem would prove that even the most unstoppable military force in human history has limits when it faces divine intervention. But that's a story for another chapter. Because first, you need to understand the full horror of what complete defeat actually looks like. The Assyrian conquest of Israel proves the most terrifying truth about warfare. Your worst enemy isn't the one who kills you. Your worst enemy is the one who erases you from history so completely that future generations won't even know you existed. What happens when the house of God burns to the ground while his chosen people watch in chains? What you're about to witness will haunt you forever, because the destruction of Jerusalem wasn't just military defeat. It was a systematic annihilation of everything that made the Jewish people who they were. And it all began with one king's fatal decision to trust in human alliances instead of divine protection. Picture this scene. The year is 597 BCE, and standing in the throne room of Jerusalem is King Jehoiakim, staring at a message that will seal the fate of his kingdom. The seal belongs to Nebuchadnezzar II, the most powerful emperor on earth, ruler of a Neo-Babylonian empire that now stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. The message is simple: submit or be destroyed. Jehoiakim made his choice, and it was catastrophic. But here's what makes Judah's final chapter so psychologically terrifying. This wasn't a sudden invasion by a distant enemy. This was a culmination of a carefully orchestrated strategy that had been in motion for decades. Nebuchadnezzar had been watching, waiting, planning the complete destruction of Jerusalem since the day he ascended the Babylonian throne. If you can't even summon the courage to hit a subscribe button to learn about the most devastating siege in ancient history, how would you handle watching 400 years of sacred history burn to ash while enemy soldiers drag your children into slavery? If 30 seconds of commitment to understanding the darkest moment in Jewish history isn't worth your time, scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why learning about the destruction of God's house doesn't move you to action. The first siege came swiftly. Nebuchadnezzar marched against Jerusalem, and King Jehoiakim died during the siege, leaving his 18-year-old son Jehoiakim to face the Babylonian war machine. The city surrendered after just 3 months, and the young king was deported to Babylon along with 10,000 of Jerusalem's elite, the skilled craftsmen, the warriors, the wealthy families who formed the backbone of Judean society. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't finished. He installed Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah as a puppet king, believing he could control Judah through a compliant ruler. For 11 years, this arrangement held, until Zedekiah made the same fatal mistake that had destroyed his predecessor. Against all counsel, against all wisdom, against the desperate warnings of the prophet Jeremiah, Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. He sought alliance with Egypt, convinced that Pharaoh's armies could protect Jerusalem from Nebuchadnezzar's wrath. But the Egyptian military was a shadow of its former glory, and when the Babylonian war machine rolled south in 588 BCE, Egypt's promised aid never materialized. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 18 months. Think about that for a moment. 18 months of watching children starve while Babylonian siege engines pounded the walls day and night. 18 months of praying for rescue that never came. 18 months of slow, agonizing death as the greatest city in the ancient world was methodically strangled to death. Archaeological evidence from Mount Zion reveals the absolute horror of this siege. Arrowheads, broken pottery, and burned debris layers tell the story of a population driven to desperation. The Babylonian siege of Jerusalem lasted for quite a while, even though many of the inhabitants wanted to give up. King Zedekiah simply was not willing to pay tribute to Nebuchadnezzar, and the direct result of this was the destruction of the city and the temple. But the most chilling aspect of the siege wasn't the military tactics, it was the psychological warfare. Nebuchadnezzar positioned his armies not just to conquer Jerusalem, but to break the spirit of its people. Every day that passed without surrender was another day of children dying from starvation. Every week that Zedekiah held out was another week of watching his kingdom collapse from within. And then came the 9th day of the 4th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign. The walls were breached. What followed was systematic butchery. Zedekiah fled by night through the king's garden, but the Babylonian army pursued him and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. They captured him and brought him to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah in the land of Hamath. And then Nebuchadnezzar passed judgment on him. The punishment was designed to be the last thing Zedekiah ever saw. Nebuchadnezzar slaughtered Zedekiah's sons before his eyes, then put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in chains to be taken to Babylon. The last king of Judah spent his remaining years in darkness, haunted by the final image of his children's execution. But the destruction of Jerusalem's leadership was just the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's revenge. According to the Bible, following the fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonian general Nebuzaradan was sent to complete its destruction. The city and Solomon's temple were plundered and destroyed, and most of the Judeans were taken by Nebuchadnezzar into captivity in Babylon. The burning of Solomon's temple was more than military conquest. It was spiritual apocalypse. The temple that had taken 7 years to build, covered with enough gold to purchase kingdoms, housing the Ark of the Covenant itself, was reduced to smoking rubble in a single day. He burned down the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. He destroyed all the important buildings in the city. Then he supervised the entire Babylonian army as they tore down the walls of Jerusalem on every side. Think about the psychological impact of this destruction. For 400 years, the temple had been the center of Jewish life, the visible proof that God dwelt among his people. Its destruction didn't just remove a building, it shattered the foundation of Jewish faith. If God's own house could burn, if his chosen city could fall, if his anointed king could die in chains, what did any of it mean? But here's what makes the Babylonian conquest so absolutely terrifying. The deportations were designed to ensure that Jewish culture would never recover. He pillaged Jerusalem and deported tens of thousands of Jews to his capital in Babylon. All the deportees were drawn from the upper classes, the wealthy, and craftsmen. Ordinary people were allowed to stay in Judah. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated cultural genocide. By removing the educated elite, the skilled craftsmen, the religious leaders, and the royal family, Nebuchadnezzar was decapitating Jewish civilization. The people left behind were farmers and laborers who couldn't maintain the complex religious, legal, and cultural systems that defined Jewish identity. The mass deportation to Babylonia began what history calls the Babylonian exile. Unlike the Assyrian conquest of Israel, where the 10 tribes simply disappeared, the Babylonian strategy was more sophisticated. They wanted to preserve Jewish culture just long enough to corrupt and control it. But here's the question that should haunt every person of faith who has ever taken God's presence for granted. What happens when a nation built on faith loses a very house of its God? Because the destruction of the temple wasn't just about losing a building. It was about losing the system of sacrifice that maintained a covenant between God and his people. For 400 years, Jews had brought their offerings to Jerusalem. Now there was nowhere to bring them. For 400 years, priests had performed daily sacrifices. Now there were no priests, no altar, no holy place. The deportees in Babylon faced an existential crisis that would reshape Judaism forever. How do you worship a God whose house has been destroyed? How do you maintain faith in promises that seem to have been broken? How do you raise children to believe in a covenant when the physical evidence of that covenant lies in ruins? And yet, somehow, in the darkness of exile, something extraordinary began to happen. The destruction that was meant to end Judaism became the crucible that refined it. The exile that was meant to scatter the people became the experience that united them. The loss of the temple that was meant to destroy their faith became the catalyst that made their faith portable, personal, and unshakable. But that transformation wouldn't happen immediately. First, they had to endure 70 years of wondering if God had abandoned them forever. 70 years of watching their children grow up in a foreign land. 70 years of asking the question that would haunt them through every dark night. Was this the end of God's people? Or was something greater being born from the ashes of everything they had lost? Because while Solomon's temple burned and Jerusalem's walls crumbled, while kings died in chains and children were marched into slavery, a promise was already being prepared that would shake the foundations of every empire on earth. The exile wouldn't last forever, and when it ended, the people who returned would be so fundamentally transformed that they would never again worship foreign gods, never again trust in human alliances, never again forget that their true strength came from faith, not fortresses. What if everything you thought you knew about ancient warfare was wrong? What if the most successful military force in ancient history wasn't the one with the best weapons, the strongest armor, or the largest armies, but the one that understood something about human nature that every other civilization missed? After 9 hours of exploring the impossible victories, devastating defeats, and miraculous survivals of the Israelites, we've arrived at the most chilling question of all. How did a nation of escaped slaves become the blueprint for every special operations unit, psychological warfare campaign, and underdog victory in human history? Because when you strip away the miraculous interventions, the divine promises, and the supernatural elements, what remains is the most revolutionary understanding of warfare ever developed. And the tactics, strategies, and principles that the ancient Israelites pioneered are still being used by modern military forces today, often without even realizing their origins. If you've watched 9 hours of the most impossible military history ever recorded, and you still can't commit 30 seconds to hitting the subscribe button, then maybe you're exactly the kind of person who would have stayed in Egypt rather than risk the desert journey to freedom. If learning about the foundations of modern warfare, the psychology of victory against impossible odds, and the spiritual principles that built an empire isn't worth your support, scroll down to the comments and explain to everyone why the legacy of legendary courage doesn't inspire you to action. Let's start with the weapons, because while everyone focuses on David's sling and Goliath's sword, the real story of Israelite warfare is far more complex and terrifying than most people realize. The Bronze Age saw the Israelites employing short swords and daggers, largely made of bronze. These were accompanied by spears and slings for ranged attacks. But here's what makes their weapon choices so psychologically brilliant. They weren't trying to outgun their enemies. They were trying to outthink them. The sling, which modern people dismiss as a primitive shepherd's tool, was actually one of the most lethal weapons in ancient warfare. Ancient peoples used the sling in combat. Armies included both specialist slingers and regular soldiers equipped with slings as a supplementary weapon. A skilled slinger could achieve ranges of up to 400 meters with deadly accuracy. The stones they hurled could penetrate armor, shatter bones, and kill instantly. But the Israelites understood something about slings that their enemies didn't. They weren't just weapons of war. They were weapons of terror. Imagine facing an enemy army where every shepherd boy could kill you from a distance you couldn't even see clearly. Imagine the psychological impact of watching your heavily armored champions fall to stones thrown by teenagers. The khopesh was an amalgamation of a sword and an axe. The shape of the blade is straight until it reaches the last half, where it sweeps out into a curved cutting edge. The entire sword from handle to blade was cast from one piece of bronze. But the Israelites didn't just adopt these weapons, they adapted them for their unique style of warfare. When the Iron Age ushered in the era of stronger, more durable iron swords, the Israelites were among the first to recognize that superior metallurgy meant nothing without superior strategy. While their enemies were building bigger chariots and heavy armor, the Israelites were perfecting something far more dangerous: mobility, deception, and psychological warfare. Here's where their tactical genius becomes truly chilling. Usually outnumbered, they were far more effective when they employed guerrilla tactics. Some of these included feints, decoys, ambushes, and diversionary maneuvers. Night movements and night attacks were also used. The Hebrews also developed a battle cry that would frighten or dishearten the enemy. Think about this for a moment. While the Egyptians were perfecting chariot formations and the Assyrians were building siege engines, the Israelites were pioneering the psychological warfare techniques that special operations forces still use today. The ambush at Ai, where Joshua's army pretended to retreat and then attack from behind, is textbook asymmetric warfare. Modern military academies teach this exact same tactic. But here's what makes Israelite warfare so psychologically terrifying. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about something far more fundamental. On their third attempt, the Israelites set up an ambush out of sight of the city, and then pulled back their assault force as if in flight. The unsuspecting Benjaminites sallied out from the safety of the city to pursue the fleeing army, leaving Gibeah defenseless. This wasn't just military strategy. This was the systematic exploitation of human psychology. The Israelites understood that every enemy army, no matter how professional, how well-trained, how experienced, had one fatal weakness: the assumption that they were fighting conventional enemy using conventional tactics. But the Israelites were never conventional. From the moment Moses led them out of Egypt, they were doing things that shouldn't have been possible: walking through a sea, marching around walls until they fell, defeating armies with trumpets and torches. Every victory broke the rules of how warfare was supposed to work. And here's the most chilling part: their enemies never adapted. After centuries of watching Israelite victories that defied explanation, surrounding nations still prepared for conventional warfare against an unconventional enemy. They still built walls against armies that made walls collapse. They still assembled massive forces against enemies who specialized in turning size into a disadvantage. The weapon classifications in terms of short-range swords, spears, middle-range javelin, and long-range bows, slings tell only part of the story. Because the Israelites understood that the most powerful weapon in any conflict isn't made of bronze or iron. It's made of faith, courage, and absolute conviction that victory is possible even when every visible circumstance suggests defeat. But let me tell you about the most terrifying weapon, the one that no enemy could defend against, the one that won more battles than all their slings and sword combined. It was their identity. For the Israelites, survival was identity. War was more than land. Every battle wasn't just about territory or resources or political advantage. It was about the fundamental question of whether they would continue to exist as a distinct people with a unique calling and a divine destiny. This is why they fought with such intensity. This is why they achieved impossible victories. This is why they survived when 10 tribes disappeared entirely, why they endured exile and returned, why they maintained their identity through centuries of dispersion and persecution. When David faced Goliath, he wasn't just fighting for military victory. He was fighting for the principle that size doesn't determine outcome, that faith can overcome force, that the God of Israel was more powerful than the gods of the Philistines. When Gideon's 300 faced the Midianite hordes, they weren't just using clever tactics. They were demonstrating that divine favor could multiply human capability exponentially. But here's what makes the Israelite military legacy so psychologically profound. They proved that the greatest strategic advantage isn't superior weapons or larger armies or better fortifications. The greatest strategic advantage is absolute certainty that your cause is worth dying for. And this certainty created something unprecedented in ancient warfare. Soldiers who fought not just for conquest or plunder or glory, but for survival in the deepest spiritual sense. Men who would risk everything because losing meant losing not just their lives, but their identity, their purpose, their reason for existence. Modern military psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades. They call it existential warfare, combat where the stakes transcend individual survival or even national interests and become about fundamental questions of meaning, purpose, and identity. And the research consistently shows that forces motivated by existential concerns fight with intensity and creativity that purely material motivations cannot match. The Israelites weren't just defending territory. They were defending the idea that small nations can survive in a world of empires, that faith-based societies can thrive among secular powers, that divine promises can overcome human limitations. Every victory proved these ideas were true. Every defeat threatened to prove them false. This is why their military history reads like a collection of impossible stories.